Okay, I welcome you all with love and peace. Hashem Yaku Kadisha Brihu Ushinate Bi'ilo Ar Imulaya Chimuki Belovke Biuda Shalom Shem Kozrael Kolam. That's a prayer for the merging of the heavens and earth and also the heart and the mind, which is really the way that's needed for us to understand things. So we're doing Parsha Bamidbar, the desert. And but I want to just have people understand where these parshas come from. So we're going to go over here so people can see that actually come out of the Torah. This is a 360-year-old Torah from Spain. And we read it a little bit, the daily Parsha. And then what we're doing now is discussing it. But it didn't come out of the blue. It comes from 3,400 years of history. These deep teachings. And you can maybe photograph it a little closer so you see that it's old and it's on parchment. Okay, very good. Now I'm going to sit and we'll get started with this. It's always nice to have a little context of what's going on. So, Bamidbar, what's going on? It's freedom. They've just left the slavery, the mind control of Pharaoh. And the truth is, only 20% left. 80% were not able to break the mind control. And literally they perished in the ninth plague of darkness. So honestly, there's a message there. Not everybody's ready to get this. And that's a hard thing to say. It's not even democratic. But it is what's going on. Okay? And so that's the level we're speaking to. And hopefully everybody will get it. And in time, everybody will get it. But today, I'm speaking more to the 20% who chose to follow Moshe out into the desert. So what's the symbolism of the desert? The desert represents the emptiness. The desert represents the emptiness of the mind. So they go out in the desert, what happens? They have to let go all the thought forms of enslavement, which is exactly the struggle that we're seeing today. Mind control, enslavement of the mind. The Pharaoh didn't happen just 3,400 years ago. It's happening throughout history, and it's happening right now. And our job is to wake up. Our job is to go to the desert, to go to the emptiness where we're free of all the limiting thought forms and belief systems that we've been programmed with. It's a big job. It took Moshe 40 years. Had to actually bring a whole new generation in, except for a few people. That's how heavy it is. But we're not going to wait 40 years. There's enough people ready to get it now. That's why this is important. So now we've got the symbolism of the desert. Now, there's more to it. Why was the Torah presented in the desert? Because there are no boundaries in the desert. There's no limitations, and there's no ownership. And it's open to everyone throughout the world, not just Am Israel. It's everyone. That's the beauty of the desert. Now I'm going to talk about ownership for a second because it's a key to a healthy relationship. If we're going to be in the desert where everybody needs to be to wake up, there's no ownership. So that means even in relationship, there can't be ownership. If there's ownership, there isn't freedom of the mind to wake up to know God. Doesn't mean, and that's key to really understanding sacred relationship. Just think about that for a second. Any codependency keeps you, is a hindrance to waking up. So, freedom, no boundaries, wildness of the desert. I tend to be a little wild, so, okay. Wildness of the desert, beyond the rules, open to everybody, and no ownership. And most important, bitul ha'esh, emptiness. So, that's the setting that we're talking about. The first thing Moshe does is listen to God. That's a good start. And the very opening is, God speaks to him and says, well, let's take a census. Now, is it that God doesn't know what the number of people there are? Of course not. The census was counting people and moving from slavery, where you don't exist, you aren't special, you are expendable slave. Have we heard that before? How about listening to the New World Order, who are basically saying humans are going to be expendable. And we're going to, hook you up mechanically to computers. Well, we're not meant to be computers, folks. We're meant to be unique souls. That's what the counting is about, so that we can wake up to God. Computers don't wake up to God. Computers don't allow the existence of God. AI is not about God. I always say AI God, but we're talking about power and control. The point is, the power of God exists within us as us. And so that's what we have to really get here, that we are doing the classic struggle with Pharaoh, really important to get, and the freedom comes going out in the desert, letting go of all our thought forms, and going to that emptiness. That's the big message. So first step, you're no longer a slave, you're no longer expendable, every person counts. So when they count the people, we move from being in a slave mind into unique, awakened individual. Now, what's interesting here, and it's a subtle but very important point, is that yes, we have unique individuals, and their light contributes to the light of the greater whole. Now, that's very different than socialism or communism, which says, you don't exist, everything's for the better good of the community. That's not the teaching here. The teaching is the interplay between the individual and the society, how the individual light contributes to the greater light of the whole society, and how the greater light of the society creates and contributes to the light of the individual. There's a play, but there's a need for both the individual and the society and the evolvement of both. That's how it's distinctly different from what's trying to be pushed, of socialism and communism. But actually, if you really understand anything about history, you can see that the one world government type of people actually aren't interested in socialism and communism. That was just a way to entrap people. It's the next level up, which is called enslavement of everybody. That's really the struggle going on. Didn't start this week? No. Didn't start last 100 years? No. It's been going on even before the time of Pharaoh. Back to the time of Nimrod, 4,000 years ago, capturing of the souls of humanity. So, nothing new here, except this is the time when we're going to break through. And it did happen then too. So that's the setting for us to understand. Okay? Now, there is a piece here, okay? We're free. We've cleared the thought forms. We're open to all creation. And we have no boundaries. Hit pashtut. What does that mean? It means free to move in any direction. It's a quality of liberation. It's right there in the desert, open to everybody. But Moses now has to find a mountain to receive the Torah. Okay? The symbolism. And he doesn't look for the tallest mountain. He looks for a humble mountain. And the symbolism is very, very important. So we have what I just talked about, freedom of the mind. But now the next thing is humility. It's essential on the spiritual path. Now what does humility mean? Histalvut, seeing God and everyone equally. Very important. So we have to take the humbleness of the mountain. We're going to go see our humble mountain out here because we're fortunate to be surrounded by mountains. So we're going to go out and look for a humble mountain. Well, I think I found a humble mountain. Just look behind me. It's not that very high. It's less than 6,000 feet. We're at 4,000 feet. And so the mountain is symbol. The mountain is the energy, and it has a certain power to it, which we can take in. But we're going to focus on the humble mountain. And we're surrounded by this. This is really, really nice. So we live in a desert, right? But we also, like Moses, found a humble mountain. So there we go. We're all set. Now we're going to go back inside now that we've seen the humble mountain. What? Yeah. Okay.
24/7.
You just have to find something here.
All day long.
Don't. A-my-L. Okay, now we've had our show and tell of Humble Mountain. But the symbolism is very important, right? Because with humility, we see our oneness. And that's a key, okay? So a big part of the spiritual path is understanding our oneness with each other, which happens when we're in a state of humility, which is about oneness. Histalvut. Now, there's some more symbolism here, and I'm just going to just touch in on it. But the main thing, and I'm just going to repeat it for a second, is the desert is the symbol of a quiet mind, which is needed to know God. It's a place where we've let go of all our concepts, thoughts, and ideas of who we are, because we can't know God if we have a cluttered mind with all our concepts and preconceptions. And there is this mountain, which we just showed in our desert where we live, where, again, humility is absolutely key for the liberation process. Now, there's a little bit more symbolism, and so there's a counting. And it's interesting that the Levites weren't counted with the regular group. How come? I'm as actually a genetic Levite. I have 37 Levite genes. It's like, what's going on? Why aren't we being counted? Well, there's a reason. Is that the Levites were the ones that didn't worship the golden calf. They're the only ones, 100% did not worship the golden calf. Pretty important little message here, because they maintained the faith in the one God. They maintained faith, which leads to truth in the one God. And so they were honored. And so now we're looking at a subtle reorganization. And it's played out in the way they traveled through the desert. The outer four directions were three groups of each of the tribes. So of the 12 tribes, there was three in each direction. And they were, in a sense, the body. And it represents the four elements: air, earth, water, and fire. Okay, that's cool. And then the inner circle were the Levites. And they surrounded the ark. You see, and those facing east were the Kohanim, and then there the three other Levite tribes. Okay, so that's the key in this picture. So now we have another level of symbolism, is that the outer is the body and the inner is the spirit. And the Levites represent, and actually not represented, were empowered and directed to hold the Spirit. Interesting. And so the symbolism of how they counted is really interesting. The 12 tribes were counted from the age of 20, which is when you're old enough to go to war, to the age of 60. Go to war means out in the world, actually, in that way. The Levites get counted from after the first month of birth. Well, just so you understand, the symbolism is real simple. We didn't always know in those days whether you're going to make it or not. So you had to wait a month to figure, okay, is this baby going to make it? But the message is, from the very beginning of their life, they're committed to God. Their whole life is about God. And that's important, and that things were designed that way. There are three tribes of Levites, and besides the Kohanim, and the tribe that got to do handle the Torah were the Kohites, which I kind of believe I might be, but I have no proof. But the point is, they had the most faith, and I'm going to explain what I mean by faith. It's not blind faith. Their faith was based on truth. Because their faith was based on the truth of the existence of God, they were the ones who could handle the ark. And that's something for all of us to understand, is that when we're talking about faith, it's based on the truth of knowing the existence of God and the oneness of God. So that begins to make some clarity. So that's why they were given that task. So we have the outer circle of the body, the inner circle of the spirit, and one wonders a little bit how this all works. And we have two examples in history. So first we have a society based on this, as we're talking about, and we look at King David and King Solomon, and maybe Hezekiah, but then it doesn't hold. There's only one other society where we see that happen, Ashoka. People don't know who Ashoka is. He was a great Buddhist king who, again, put spirit at the center of the nation. And Ashoka's reign was a golden age. So those are our two real examples where spirit has been put at the center of a society, and it brings a golden age for all the people. So we don't want to limit it to Am Israel here, saying that that's where we need to go, and that's where we will go. And that's why this Bamidbar is so important. So now we've done the symbolism. The outer is more the body, the inner is the spirit, and that has to be reactivated if we're going to go into the Messianic times. It has to be there. Okay, so all of us, that's our responsibility. So now I'm going to go a little further in talking about the Bamidbar, because there's a whole other piece to this. So we have the desert, we have the emptiness, the symbols of the emptiness, but don't just stay there. We're not going to do that. we're going to go to the real emptiness, the patul ha'esh, the emptiness within us. Because we can look out, and that's fine. We can do beautiful walks in nature. That's all good. But there's a much higher level within us where we get to know the oneness. And that higher level within us, the patul ha'esh, is the inner emptiness. This is the key to all spiritual life. It's actually a key to understanding Torah. The Torah is about bitul ha'esh. It's the deepest level, which is we're being taught in this Parsha. Bitul ha'esh, the inner emptiness, which there are different ways, but I'll say the 6 foundations, 7-fold peace helps us create a quiet mind that allows the inner emptiness. That's the key here. So what's the inner emptiness about? That's the pathway to knowing our oneness with God. That's a big deal. So all that I teach, really all that the Torah is teaching, is about creating the inner emptiness. Rabbi Nachman, who I've mentioned a few times here, and also the Baal Shem Tov, talk about this. They don't use the word inner emptiness. The Baal Shem Tov, in one of his main books that's been translated in English, talks about that meditation is 7 times more important than reading the Torah. Pretty interesting statement. Doesn't mean you shouldn't read the Torah, because you need to have the outer fullness too. Rabbi Nachman says the same thing. He actually says, go out and speak to God directly with nobody in between. And that's again, the inner desert being activated. And he actually says those people who are Torah scholars, this is really his teaching here, but don't have that faith of God, don't really know God, but have the intellectual, that's a lower Torah. I'm using a nice word. He uses a different word. It's a lower Torah. Very important thing. It doesn't mean we don't do these things, but what counts is the inner emptiness, the inner desert. Now that's the deeper symbolism. So when we go into that inner desert, beyond the mind is kind of the busy desert, or busy, that's when we begin to experience the oneness of God. Now, Kabbalistically, there's grace that's needed to experience the oneness. Okay? And they call it the great-grandmother. El-Ah Ilaha. El-Ah Ilaha, the name of the great-grandmother. I'll say it again, just sounds Sufi. El-Ah Ilaha. The great-grandmother, the grace of the great-grandmother is needed ultimately to experience the oneness with God. That's what happens when we go to the inner desert, into the inner emptiness. And we honor that inner emptiness. That's the great mystical teaching of the Torah. It's the great liberation teaching. And part of that quality, El-Ah, Ilaha, is a part of the liberation process, to know our oneness with God. So what comes out of that then is one other thing. Shiviti Sim Lignid Tamid, which means to see the dance of God in all creation, in every person. That comes from the inner going to the outer. So we're empowered to have that experience, to see, I'm going to say really to experience the play of God in all creation. Shiviti Sim Lignid Tamid, that's Proverbs 16:8. Now, what's the point? So when we have the inner desert that we become one with, within ourselves, then it enables us to see God in all creation. And it enables us to love our neighbor as ourselves, because we're seeing the oneness. That's kind of the steps that happens. Not from outer to inner, but from inner to outer as primary. So we can walk in nature and get all that good stuff, but if we don't move to the inner desert, the inner emptiness, we don't get it. So why am I emphasizing it? Because in the whole process of waking up, that inner desert, Bitul HaEsh, the inner emptiness, is what happens. And we walk in that Bitul HaEsh, the emptiness inside. It allows us to completely be the expression of the world, of the divine will. I'll say it again. When we have created the inner emptiness of Bitul HaEsh, I mean all the time now, okay? But it doesn't start that way. It starts a little bit and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But when that's there, and there's no obstructions to the truth of who we are, then the will of God vibrates through the inner emptiness, and we're being able to be the expression in the outer world of the will of God. That's where it all connects. And we need that grace as part of that. Il-ah, il-amah. Okay, the great-grandmother, that fully activates it. And that is grace. We can't control that. It just happens when it happens. So that is the bigger picture of really the liberation, enlightenment teachings of the Torah. And so I bless everyone that we may be in Bamidbar consciousness of the emptiness of the inner desert within ourselves, and in that way, with the power of grace, il-ah, il-amah, of the great-grandmother, we're able then to truly experience our oneness with all creation, and then take that into the outer world where we see the dance of the divine in all creation. Shalom, shalom, shalom. Amen.